Sustainability Studies, and I'm happy to moderate this very exciting panel here today. Now, what we'll talk about is we'll reflect upon the importance of public participation, also in the context of the recent 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We'll ask to what extent public participation being a human right really plays a role in climate decision making. And today we have a very impressive lineup of panelists extending way beyond the panel. We have a number of NGOs. We have the representative from the Office of High Commissioner on Human Rights, and I will introduce them to you in a minute. The purpose of this side event is really to explore public participation from local to global level in climate decision making, and to really have an open conversation, not just one panel discussion after the other, but really an open conversation around this topic. And we'll invite you also later to become part of this conversation and share your stories as well. Now, I will probably start from the right. I think that makes the most sense. We have Adrián Martínez Blanco, who is the director and founder of the NGO La Ruta del Clima, and he's currently also a Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies. Then we have, Luz Falivene, a director from the Fundación Tierra, Vida, and she's also, which is a youth-led organization from Argentina, and she's also the founder of Sustentabilidad sin Fronteras. On my left, we have Ann-Kathrin Schneider from BUND, Germany, which is also part of Friends of the Earth, German NGO. Then we have Svetlana Romanko from 350.org. She's a regional coordinator for Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia. Moving on, we have Raquel Gomez, who is from the 5C Citizen Council in Costa Rica. Then we have Nana Birk from LIFE, which is a German NGO specializing on education, environment, and equality. And it's also a member of the Women and Gender Constituency. And last but not least, we have Diego Valadares Vasconcelos Neto. He is Human Rights Officer in the Right to Development section of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Welcome. Now, we'll have around 60 minutes of open discussion up here. I will provide a couple of guiding questions. I always turn left and right when I see hands. Just feel free to chip in and share your stories and share your thoughts. And after that, we'll have around 30 minutes of open discussion with you, where I really invite you to share your stories and not just ask questions, but also share your own stories. Now, to start us off, as many of you may have been aware, on Monday there was a side event here just across the hall on public participation in human rights. And in this context, also in the context of the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I want to understand why are human rights so important, and particularly the right to public participation. Why is it so important in the concept of climate action? And if you could also provide a couple of examples from your work, and maybe to have a good comparison, we'll start with Adrián from the NGO side, and then have Diego respond from the UN side.
Thank you for being here. And I guess for us, one of the main things that drive us to be interested in public participation is because for us, the convention has two streams of work. One of it is, of course, keeping us under 1.5 and reducing emissions, but the other one is well-being, the well-being of people. So when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about the right to shape our development. And that's where people should come in, because not only will they be implementing climate actions, but also how this process of creating the structures to implement climate actions, they will reflect some interest or not. And this is why representation and why the different sectors of society should be present. And in the case of a Central American NGO, as we are heavily underrepresented in this process. Our points of view, our needs are not being voiced because we're mostly not here. And as Patrick was, in our work, we work a lot with stakeholders and we try to connect them. But one of the things that we have been doing here that kind of illustrate how we are not present here is that we're doing a project on trying to interview 10 young Central Americans present here, and we had a really hard time of finding them. I mean, there's about from 19 to 25,000 people that usually come to COP, and we would think that just to find 10 people from our region that are sort of young, and to see what are they doing, how are they influencing the process, and what does that mean, and being able to talk to them was one of those challenges. And for us, this kind of reflects the whole notion of participation. How can we shape development if we're not here? How can we then implement actions and relate to the context and tell people back in our countries to maintain climate action through time and to make it efficiently if they're not engaged in the process?
Thank you. Diego, do you want to share a few thoughts, especially in the context of the recent anniversary of the Universal Declaration?
Thanks a lot, Patrick. And I was very happy that I didn't start by mentioning the right to development. I work in a section of the Office of the High Commissioner that is specifically dedicated to the right to development. So everyone has the right to contribute to participate in, and to enjoy the benefits of development. And the element of participation is essential to get the final element of enjoyment as well. It's a human rights. It's important because it's a human rights, first of all. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and several other of the core human rights instruments. All of them have some provision on participation. But beyond that, I think I then captured a bit the essence that it's more effective, it's better, you make better decisions, more legitimate, more targeted, you get more points of view. So it's essential for good decision making to have participation. And us in the human rights community, I believe, have learned a lot with the environmentalist community as well, and the environmental agenda. And I'm very happy to announce, maybe to most of you, it might not be known, but in the last session of the Human Rights Council, so the Human Rights Council is like the collective states bodies, it's the Assembly of Human Rights of the UN that sits in Geneva. In its last session, that was last September, it adopted these guidelines for states on the effective implementation of the right to participate in public affairs. And I think this is a very, very essential instrument. When it was adopted, our office had the mandate now to disseminate. It was done through a very participatory process. There were consultations in 5 continents. And there's a whole section on participation at the international, supranational, global level. And I think the guidelines provide very, very useful instruments. I don't want to go very in detailed in them, but they mention that states should ensure the freedom of expression, should allow participation, they shouldn't restrict participation in forums where international agreements, debates are being held, no discrimination, no intimidation and reprisal, they have to facilitate visas, allow entry. So there are many provisions here that I think can feed the debate for what will follow on. And one last comment for this first round is that this COP has already had some good news on this front. I think the adoption of the indigenous peoples and local communities platform is a very interesting development. That's a very unique process. I think now of how the ILO, the International Labour Organization, is that you don't have just states represented. Now we have another body, a consultative body, where you have parity between states and indigenous people. So that's a very good news. But there's still concern in many of the areas that are still being negotiated for the global stock take. It's very important that participation, inputs by civil society, scientific bodies and agencies should be allowed. There are many other places where I believe negotiators could take into account so that their decisions now and in the future are better, more legitimate, more effective. Oh.
Thank you. Thank you for this perspective from the international level. Now, we have a lot of NGOs here on the panel that work in different countries, in Costa Rica and Germany, then also more globally with a focus on Eastern Europe. So I'd be very curious to hear, what are your experiences working with different processes of public participation at national level? What is working well, and where do you see possibilities for reform? What needs to change? I'll just leave it out there, and whoever wants to go first, be my guest.
Yes, thank you. I was really happy and delighted to hear the news from the UN resolution, which actually provides provides legal framework and just civil rights implementation on and abiding on the around United Nations international gathering. Why it's happening? But I'm also would like to add that this is specifically appreciated in a day when Ukraine committed, which was a result of which is today. And I would like to announce and highlight it right here because a few hours earlier, our Minister of Ecology and Environmental Environment and Natural Resources announced that Ukraine would review its NDC commitment to set the best ambition for our country. And we welcome that commitment. And why that happened? That would not happen with no wide participation of every community, every city, and every regional level. Because to my absolutely and entirely fair opinion, what the most important process was initiated on a very, not very basic, but on a grassroots level. How actually we made this successful participation example? There were 4 cities in Ukraine which in a few months made the commitments initiated bottom-up, both and top-down approaches, and they committed to transit the energy balance of their cities and their communities onto 100% renewables till 2050. Of course, we truly believe it will happen earlier because IPCC report shows that we have to move quickly towards 100.5 degrees Celsius to keep global warming on that scientifically based level. But at the same time, these commitments prove us that those steps which we have made in a few years, explaining people what climate strategy is, what ambitious energy plan is, trying to facilitate local communities dialogue within the state authorities and local authorities, that significantly proves that only combining both approaches, grassroots influence, participation of active citizens within the regional level of responsibility from local authorities, and taking this creating ambitious energy plans on a regional level, and only based on that, a really powerful national strategy could be grown, and now we see that result in NDC commitment. Ukraine now is showing leadership by committing to review its climate goal, and every country in the world should make a similar commitment. I strongly believe within my organization and what we are doing developing climate movement. And next one, what I would like to highlight specifically here, we all here participate in COP24 are the best example of participation on different and participative approach on different levels. Why? Only a few years ago, we made these alarm and press conferences and statements that the human rights are under danger and we all have to act immediately to provide the legal support and security for those whose rights have been violated. And that's again proves that in these few days we have successes in European Parliament already is going to make some steps towards providing and helping those citizens from Eastern Europe and Caucasus and Central Asia, because we have representatives from each part of that region, just to get proper defense. UN, we have seen that make steps towards proper guidance and regulation of these international events, and we all just supporting that idea of freedom, which have to be a part of every participation process. We all contribute to that very significantly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Svetlana. Since we are right now in Europe, I would also like to hear the perspective from Germany or about participation processes in Germany in climate decision making. Perhaps, Anne-Catherine, you'd like to go first.
Thank you. I just question, like I will go to Germany, but I just had one question which I found really interesting, what you just said on the decision of the Human Rights Council, because as many of you know, maybe that our colleagues, some of our colleagues we work with from the Ukraine and from other countries, civil society colleagues who wanted to participate in the discussions here, were sent back to their countries at the border and were not allowed to take part in as civil society actors in these negotiations here. So I'm wondering, how can we use that decision of the Human Rights Council to now do something against the case that happened here in Poland just a week ago?
Should I jump in? So this is a decision of the Human Rights Council. This document was adopted. You can mention Resolution 39/11 from the Human Rights Council in any petition that is presented. The domestic procedures of the case here of Poland, I'm not in a position to assess and to give particular advice, but what we can say is that there's an authority of this document because it was adopted without any, by consensus, without a vote, no abstention or no vote against. So all states agree. For instance, in paragraph 107, that states should facilitate the timely issuance of visas for those wishing to participate in international forums. So that's a provision, and that's quite an important language that has been included in the document. So this is an authoritative document that could add, and not speaking about this concrete case, but in general, if states go against what is seen here, this can be brought into attention, first to domestic authorities, second to special procedures, which are independent experts that are nominated, are elected by the Human Rights Council on freedom of expression, on environment, on indigenous people. So many special rapporteurs, 34 of these experts elected by the Human Rights Council issued a very important decision, a very important statement last week encouraging ambition here. In May, some of them issued a statement concerned about a restrictive civic space in the host country of this edition of the COP. So this document is also out there. And if that is the case, and if undue, and I'm not judging here, but if undue decisions were issued disrespecting recommendations so that they issue visas promptly, they facilitate that, this should be brought into the attention. So it's one instrument more of authority to claim that.
Thank you. I mean, I'd like to encourage that as well. Ask each other questions. This is exactly the kind of conversation that we need. Would Ann-Kathrin or Nana still like to share something about the experiences in Germany in climate, public participation in climate decision making?
Okay, so in climate decision making in Germany, we have quite good structures and institutions and processes where the government allows us to participate in the setting up of strategies and plans, for example. But I also wanted to mention that we as Friends of the Earth Germany, we always participate in these decision-making processes, and I wanted to mention that it takes a lot of resources to participate in those processes, and also there's always a question of take-up, because of course when the government reaches out and invites us to the table, they also invite industry to the table, and often it's of course industry that has more power, more resources, and more influence in the process. So that makes it difficult. On the one hand, it's very time consuming. On the other hand, the results to the process and how many of our ideas are being picked up is always questionable. So in terms of participation in those kind of processes, I really want to urge representatives of governments to think about the costs to civil society and also the financial and the time costs, and that support, financial support for civil society is needed if we are to participate in decision-making processes on climate issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wait, I think Nana still has another intervention.
Yes, thank you very much. And I just want to follow up on that. But before that, I want to say that I'm very excited to be here on this panel, but because I really think that the right to participation and gender equality that are core aspects of really climate justice, and this is a very interesting and important panel. And it is when we're talking about public participation, I really want to highlight that we also have to talk about the roadblocks of public participation, and you just mentioned them, that it is people, communities, groups of societies, they're not having the equal access of participation because there are many roadblocks, such as limitation, there are socio-economical roadblocks, there's missing political infrastructure, and so on, and also within societies, there's from racism, paternalism, and so on. There are many roadblocks also that first have to be overcome to really enable full participation. And in the context of Germany, as you said, that the German government actually opened or invited civil society to participate in the elaboration of this climate action plan. I still want to highlight that a lot of groups are not there on the table. We hardly have any groups that are coming from migrant communities that are equally affected or should be equally enabled to participate in that debate. We hardly have any women's groups because women's groups also lack socioeconomic, or most of the time like socioeconomic resources. There is a lot of financial and human resources, as you said, needed to participate effectively in those areas. And we all know that we as civil society actors, we as really rights holders, unfortunately, we do not have the same possibility as business or private enterprises to really enable this kind of participation. And yeah, well, I just want to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana. I believe, Luz, maybe you can do a sort of comparative perspective from Costa Rica. Sorry, Argentina.
Yes, I'm from Argentina. In our country, public participation, and specifically referring to climate change, has been open, I think that 3 years or 4 years ago, and in formal spaces at the national level and here in the international level at the UNFCCC. I think that are very valuable spaces, but following the conversation with the colleagues, I think that also we need to think that apart from the legal requirements and also the resources that we need to participate here, I think that we also need to think on capacity building. We need to bring this to the table because maybe you have the resources to come in here, but you need to ensure that this participation is effective. I'm speaking on behalf of the youth and from a youth perspective, because you need to be here, you need to be prepared to hold an enriching, and you need to have the skills, the knowledge, all the capacity to talk and to debate, to reach your delegation, to reach other youth. I think that it's about resources, it's about the legal requirements that need to be guaranteed, but also I think that all the non-party stakeholders and the state, of course, has to focus on bringing capacity building to the youth and other NGOs and all the actors that are here in the UNFCCC sessions.
Thank you, Lucas. Yes, I think Raquel also wanted to give an input, this time on Costa Rica.
Thank you very much. In Costa Rica, our NDC promise, let's say, the confirmation of a citizen council in our country, precisely to provide the citizens to participate in climate change policy making in our country. So in 2017, last year, the Climate Change Consulting Citizen Council was 5C, as we know it, was established by an executive mandate. And this year, at the beginning of this year, we were called to these general assemblies by sector so that we could establish this citizen council, this consulting citizen council. Basically, 7 sectors were called to compose this citizen council, and we have nowadays representation from women's group, indigenous peoples, mobility and urban sustainability groups, ecosystem and biodiversity NGOs, agroforestry and fishing sector as well, transportation and infrastructure, labor unions as well. We have 1 representative, and also industry and commerce. That this sector is usually seen as a separate sector, the private sector, but in this case, in Costa Rica, for the 5C Council, was seen as another citizen group that had needs and could also contribute to solutions to climate change problem in the country. We have been operating, let's say, for almost 1 year, and it's been challenging, and we still have some challenges to overcome, but also some lessons learned from this process. First of all, we have to develop unity, and we have realized about this during this process. We come from different sectors, and even though each sector brings its own needs and proposals to the table, it is necessary to build consensus and build unity so that proposals that come from the Citizen Council can actually be taken into account by policy makers. We need to develop these proposals and our inputs, construct solutions on the basis of trust. We have to trust one another so that we can deliver effective solutions and that our voice can be heard. Governance, it's also a challenge yet. We are building this set of rules yet so that we can know how we will deliver our proposals and how we are going to make our voice heard in policy making processes. And this is something we are still figuring out, let's say. But I would like to refer to what you were saying about industry and the participation of the private sector in decision making and in these participation processes. I think we have been very successful in incorporating the voices and the needs of the private sector. And instead of, let's say, fighting among the sectors, the private sector, it's seen as a conjunction of opportunities that can actually help other sectors to participate in these processes. And we are trying in some cases to see businesses and what opportunities businesses can provide to citizen participation in policy making. And not only in policy making, but also climate action. We try to see the whole chain value when we talk about businesses and production processes, let's say, and how the different sectors can be taken into account along these value chains so that everyone can propose solutions and participate in this process to propose climate solutions for climate change. We also have some challenges related to achieving a united voice, how we can come together to a consensus and that not all the interests are seen separately, but all our major goal, which is bring effective proposals and solutions to the climate change problem, can be one voice within the 5C, and also how this voice can be legitimized by each sector and by the government when we come with our proposals. So these are still some challenges that we face. And of course, as you were saying, financing this participation. We have in our 5C group some sectors and some representatives that face some challenges when they have to come to meet or participate in the different policy-making scenarios that that are in Costa Rica, and how can we actually provide so that these sectors and these people can participate in these decision-making processes. I would say that's it.
Don't worry, you'll get another chance to provide some more input later on. I believe, Ann-Kathrin, you actually had a question to Raquel.
Yeah, Raquel, it was really interesting to hear your experiences from Costa Rica, and the one on trying to find consensus, to find consensus, to find consensus, but sometimes it really is a fight. And it's also, we've had the same experiences in Germany, that sometimes we are afraid that our positions are getting watered down, and in the end, our position is not so different from the government one, because we have to take all the different civil society. I mean, it's still more ambitious, but it's a difficult process. But then on industry, I was really curious to hear what you said, and on the private sector, because, for example, in Germany at the moment, we have a coal commission, like a commission with civil society actors, with government representatives, people from environment side and people from the private sector side, trying to negotiate a coal phase out in Germany. And we have a similar coalition commission in the mobility sector, to try to talk about how we can have a more climate-friendly mobility and construct different cars in Germany. But they're like, the interests from us and the car industry and the fossil fuel industry are like this. I mean, we want a coal phase out now because of the climate, and they want a coal phase out maybe in 150 years because they want to make the most profit as possible from the existing coal plants. So, and the same with the car industry. The car industry wants to continue producing dirty cars because we are making a lot of profit from producing dirty cars in Germany, and we say dirty cars have to end in Germany. So, like it's a fight. Yeah.
Thank you. Diego, you also want to weigh in briefly?
So, to enter in the debate a bit, I've been following the debate here in the COP on just transition, and I think that's a lot of what you were saying just now. And I think we have a lot to learn from the trade unions as well. The participation of trade unions here in the COP, of the ITUC, also, of course, the employers' unions on the table discussing as well. But on the issue of the importance of uniting, I do believe that there's ensuring that everyone is on the table, and that those who want to push for ambition, use strategies and have access to funds is very important. These guidelines, they mention, I think, everything that was said here now on funds should be available, especially for those less proficient in procedures, and capacity buildings, also important, it was mentioned. You should have permanent structures in order to have participation. But in many countries, one part of civil society that does have the resources are the trade unions, and they have the capacity to engage and to push. And many of them, from what I've heard, in some cases, there has been cases where the industry, the miners in the coal industry, they will push against. But and I think that's the beauty of trying to really push for this concept of just transition, where in many cases, in a panel on just transition and gender yesterday, it was mentioned, for instance, the fact that if the local communities unite and find alternatives, there was one example from, I think, California, somewhere in the US now, which was mentioned, where local communities were building cooperatives in order to incorporate labor that was being phased out from and then from the mines, and like that you could build in and clarify that these can be better jobs, healthier jobs. And so this is one aspect I would like to emphasize in this power struggle and relations, and how we can, from this human rights perspective of participation, ensuring funds for equal and effective participation, we can maybe get there.
Thank you very much. Well, maybe. Okay, it's good. It's good. I'm happy we have a good conversation. So please, Nan.
Yeah, I just want to chip into that really quick because I think most of you probably have heard the debate around the conflict of interest, which came up, I think, at the COP in Marrakesh, as far as I know. And we, as a woman and gender constituency, we are also very much were participating actually in that debate. And I just want to highlight one thing, that we actually reject that all of the observers here are called non-party stakeholders, because we're not one homogeneous group. We are the woman and gender constituency, youth constituency, the indigenous peoples, we are rights-based constituencies holding the rights of people up. And then we have private interests who are here, and they're actually not even, they do not want to reach the goal of the convention. They're not interested in stabilizing greenhouse gases, but they are interested in really, they have a lot of money in the fossil fuel infrastructure, and we are still have the same rights here. We are called the same name tag, and I just want to flag that this is also one of the discussions really quick, and it's an important discussion to watch out on the conflict of interest there as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Nana. You've reached into another territory which concerns the question of participatory reform or reform of stakeholder participation here at these COPs. And maybe I'd like to ask this question to the entire panel. Do you see that there's a need to somehow change the way observers are accredited, or even to have this observer status? I mean, you already did one step in that direction. What about affected people, those who are most affected by climate change? Do you see them in these halls? And before I open up, for example, you would have all come in here at the COP in Katowice to the escalator. You see the people's seat as a new innovation for virtual participation. So also maybe reflect upon technologies of participation. Is there any way to make this process more inclusive?
So to comment on that, I will make a comment on your question, and I want to address something to Raquel. And I mean, from our perspective, when we think about COP, we see that it's like 25,000, 19,000 people meeting. And somehow this gives us the idea that there's a lot of people participating. But when we actually check the numbers of people that are actually here, NGOs participants are only 4,000. And if we go back 10 years ago, yeah, the COP was half the size, but the participation of NGO was 50-50. And that's something the SBI said a while ago. And if we check then how many participants are from Western and developed countries, like, for example, the WEOC region, it's about 70%. And when they check for my region in general, Latin America, it's about 4%. So when I say that I'm looking for Central Americans here, I'm really looking for them because I can't find them. And then this is one of the questions that I think about the venue. And as they said, yeah, it's a party driven, but it's also people's rights, what they're talking about. It's about our development. And from this notion, and I don't want to bash on NGOs from the developed countries, but what I want at least from them is to learn, because there's an advocacy knowledge, know-how that they have accumulated throughout these years that we don't have. I mean, even if we get the amount of people to be here from our region, we lack the knowledge to engage as they do. We need that to scale up. And then to address what Raquel says at the national level, for example, with the Citizen Council, that we are part of one of those assemblies. I mean, where are we supposed to engage? Because at that national level, there is no climate law legislation in Costa Rica. So courts in the past have said that if you want to participate, there should be a law that tells you where to participate. If not, you don't have, because state matters are from the government. So when we talk about participation in NDC planning and climate change action, and then we think back also into the development of the Escazú agreement, we need actually concrete stuff where people can actually participate in, and then we can fit that back into the process here. And then for that, when we need the support to get them here, but also we need the support for them to, as Lou said, to participate with a real functionality and effectiveness.
Thank you, Adrian. Would anybody like to respond to this strong call?
Specifically in the case of Costa Rica, I think we have a big opportunity here, precisely because the lack of legislation, climate change legislation, like clearly stated. I think the 5C, and because of this situation, I believe we have the big 5C, the Climate Change Consulting Citizen Council in Costa Rica. I believe as the 5C, we have a big opportunity, and it's basically to make that legislation happen from the citizen point of view. There's a big openness, let's say, by the government, at least from the climate change office at this point, that the 5C can propose, that can make participation proposals for citizen participation. And I think that's an opportunity we have to, like, once in a lifetime opportunity. There is this openness, and I believe if we propose as 5C these mechanisms, they will be heard. So I believe there is a big opportunity for us as General Assemblies, as 5C representatives to bring these proposals to the government so that our voice can be heard, and that make this legislation happen with human rights embedded in this legislation. So I would say let's take advantage of this opportunity. Oh.
Yes, thank you for that questions, because they really make us think about what we really need to make and run effective city level participation to come to a next more broad national goals. So, and first of all, we have to have climate leadership. If we don't have climate leadership developed properly, if you don't have leaders who has an ability to be responsible for policy participation on their levels and who are trusted in local communities, it means it doesn't really matter is it vulnerable country or it's more developed country. In more developed countries, it's of course much easier, but even in Eastern Europe and Central Asia for these 3 years past since we start engaging people into political decision making on a level of stopping climate change, which is extremely dangerous. We have seen very successful and amazing results, and actually those seven men and women who were detained at the border and sent back to their countries violatedly, they were these kind of young leaders who made very successful commitments and campaigns in their cities on the very significant level, which what ended by adoption documents on a local level, climate strategy and study and development, some ambitious energy plans on the level of cities. But it's climate leadership is not only as a way to get where we want to get to 100.5% decrease of stabilized global warming. Also, I've heard, and thank you for that thoughtful thought, that all stakeholders should be equally engaged into just transition process. When I speak to business, even Ukraine has huge results in engaging businesses. For example, a few main banks, which are world banks as well, committed to 100% renewables in the normal everyday activity, which means they run their offices on renewable energy, starting from their own homes. The next one, a question of we have also very good examples of small cities and local communities which with small resources just making miracles on the miracle political changes in the local level. It happens very easily when, for example, first year you have no citizens engaged into energy efficiency on the local level because everyone thinks it's expensive, we have to spend time, money, resources, and we don't really understand how we save the energy afterwards. But if the local level engage some investors and resources in a committed way and they invest even something small cost into that, next year you will have double number of those people who will be willing to make energy efficiency measures. And that is how it works. And that is the best way, along with the climate leadership, how we can move on from the point where climate change is catastrophic and unstoppable. So, yes, and I would like to ask, maybe us all, yes, and if we try to combine political local leadership with the national goals on reducing of greenhouse gases emissions and adaptation measures, what would you recommend from where you are, your country, which you represent, as a most successful example? But maybe if you could share with the most impressive example of interconnected human rights defense, it would be really great to hear in a context of what we are doing these last days here in the COP, being unfortunately distracted in a way from the main thing we are here for, just participating in negotiation and making effective public pressure on proper NDC commitments and rule book development as well.
Thank you, Svetlana. I believe, Luz, I don't know if you want to take up the question or you also want to give your own input. No?
Yes, just a short comment, because I heard Raquel talking about the challenge that we face at the national level related to the governance, how we fully engage, how we meaningfully engage all the stakeholders to reach a governance in the national level, because we have to remember that we are here just for 2 weeks. And after we are returning to our countries, and how do we do? How do we enhance the governance? Because Adrian says that we are here, we have the possibility to be here and to learn from the others, from in my case, from other youth or other people here. But I think that after we have to come back to our countries. And we have to engage with other stakeholders, as my colleagues have said, with the private sector. But I think that we also have to reflect on how do we engage with these stakeholders. I think that we have to do it in an open way. I mean, we have to be critical, of course, but I think that we should also have a dialogue, a genuine dialogue, an open dialogue, and also, well, a decentralized dialogue, because I think that is another challenge that we face, or at least in Argentina, because not all the youth and not all the stakeholders has the same possibility to participate in the same way. Sometimes it's very centralized in the capitals, and not all the stakeholders, not all the communities has the possibility to meaningfully engage in this process. So that's the short comment that I wanted to mention.
Thank you. Thank you. Appeal, we could. Nana, do you want to throw in anything? If not, I'll move to open the floors.
Yeah, maybe I want to chip in there as well, because I think it is also important to really understand the linkages of participating here at this space and then being recognized as a national important actor at the national at your national home country. Because we, for example, the Women and Gender Constituency, we are bringing a lot of, or trying to bring people, communities, women who are experiencing the climate change every day here at this level, because it's vital. I mean, it's about them. It's vital that they are represented here, and all of a sudden when they come back home, they are really being recognized as actors of change. They're being invited, for example, in our case, when NDCs are supposed to be elaborated in a gender responsive way, they're all of a sudden they're seen. And so it is important to bring them here, not only that they can voice their demands here, not only that they really talk about what really is happening, climate change, and not only about acronyms acronyms and bodies and technical things, but it is also important in a national, in their home countries. And for example, this time we have tried to bring some women from the small Pacific islands here, and they were denied visas, or the visa process takes so long that until we got the finance to really tell them your funding is secured, the visa process we were not able to manage that anymore. And of course, I mean, me coming from Germany, I hardly need a visa I nearly never need a visa to go somewhere. And I think there's multiple linkages between the local level and the international level, which are very, very important.
Thank you. Before I pass on to Raquel and then Diego, I will also invite you to think about solutions. What I mentioned earlier, reform potential, but really what solutions do you think can be implemented, or who needs to make these changes in order to have a more, I guess, equal participation possibility that is not geographically skewed, as Adrian pointed out? Anyway, Raquel.
I wanted to refer to what you were saying and trying to bring somebody else said about capacity building. It's been our experience right here, right now, in this is our first COP. And it has been our experience that it is really needed to build capacities for common citizens like us to participate in these forums. I mean, it is not until you come here where you really know what this is and what you can or can't do during these forums. So I believe capacity building to really make your voice be heard in these kind of forums, it's really, really, really important. And we are taking back home this experience, and for our next our partners that will come probably next year to this COP, we will definitely, or they will be able to come more prepared than what we probably came, because we will be taking that experience to them and probably give them a little or some tools for them to participate in a more effective way in this forum. So I believe one of the things that should be done as part of the solutions, it's actually build those capacities for the common ground people that experiment those climate change impacts, those people that are really affected and more vulnerable by climate change, really be able to participate in these forums.
So speaking about Costa Rica, I think, and thinking of solutions, in Latin America, under the auspices of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, we have the Escazú Convention, Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation, Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. So this is an instrument that can, we have ARUS in Europe, so trickle down good practices, and Escazú even have a very strong language on human rights defenders and those who are under threat, so that's also very important. But one other thing I wanted to mention as well is the possibility of resorting more to information and communications technology. I think panels like this could have, maybe you could create one full day event in different parts of the world and then try to find a spot where we would have, I mentioned Escazú because why I think of ICT now is because I took part in I attended a side event where the Secretariat of Escazú was speaking through webcast, through Skype, and we had the ARUS Secretariat in Geneva also participating through Skype. And they were not here, and the dialogue could happen. So there's a lot of potential in ICTs. There are some concerns. We have seen use of technology for disinformation, for spreading skeptical discourse and disqualifying scientific knowledge that is solid already about climate change. We've seen that in elections. The office has expressed a big concern with strategies of spreading of fake news and so on. But I think the technology is one aspect. And finally, accessibility as well. I see that it is an accessible environment, but I don't know if, I haven't seen that many people in using wheelchairs or the distances. Even the design of the environment could be thought in a more accessible way. And I don't know, I would argue that there is a correlation with the lack of persons with disabilities with the accessibility, which probably there it went through some tests and so on, but I'm not too convinced that it's, we should all think of that as well.
Thank you, Diego. Just to give one example, I think you mentioned this ICT, and I believe the Climate Vulnerable Forum had organized this entirely virtual summit on, I believe, either loss and damage or a broader topic, but everything was virtual, was video messages and Skype messages. So I think there are some steps in that direction, but again, maybe this is a good time actually to open up the discussion to involve you from the audience, because you also have your experiences and you have your stories to share from your specific country context or the organizations you're involved in. But even just as observers or parties here in these COPs, you have this experience where you feel maybe that something needs to change or you're happy with what's going on. And would be very curious to hear your views. I also invite you to ask questions to the panelists as you normally do, but we still have around 30 minutes, so please, I think the floor is open. And I see a hand over there. Do we have a microphone somewhere in the room? And if you can briefly state your name and your organization or party. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. It's a really interesting panel. My name's Jessica Cook from Plan International. We're a child-centered organization looking primarily as well at girls' rights. And something I felt was potentially missing a perspective was that of children. So we've talked a lot about gender, youth, disability, but yeah, children are going to be the ones living with the consequences of the decisions we make here. And if we fail, they're the ones that are going to have less access to human rights, to education, protection, food, water, that we have had the access to. And one of those rights is also around participation, right? And something that I see in these conferences is that children are often very tokenistic. So last year, there were 2 children brought from the Pacific, which was amazing. But they give a presentation at the beginning of high-level segments, everyone applauds, everyone's really excited by this, and then we go back to our very adult discussions, and they're not included in that. So I'm just wondering, do you think there's a space for children in these kind of conferences? If there is, how do we do it, and how do we make it more inclusive for them? Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we'll collect various stories and questions. I have a gentleman here in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Juan. I come from Ecuador. My question was might be addressed to all of you guys. It's about the limit of public participation and the limits of the effects of public participation. Because of course, public participation is a procedure, but what about the outcome of public participation? What about the actual decisions that will be taken into place? Is that only public participation just like a box ticking mechanism, or is that, what might be the effect of it? And I just want to bring about the attention of the context of indigenous peoples, since it's basically my most knowledgeable frame of knowledge, which is even we in the context of indigenous peoples, they already have like the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, the ILO Convention, and so on, jurisprudence on the Inter-American human rights system, and so on, phrasing that, yeah, like public participation and the right to be consulted is, you know, a general aspect of international law and so on. But still, the ultimate decision to do a project or not, or to implement a law or not, is mostly upon the states to decide. So in that regards, what will be, you know, how can we overcome that procedure and to actually, let's, you know, move to the substantive aspect of public participation? Do you know of any potential, you know, solutions to this? Thank you.
We'll take another question, or maybe a couple more. It was the gentleman beside you.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Abul Bashar. I am from Bangladesh. I am working for British Council Bangladesh chapter. I would like to share some experience. Then I have some questions. So, uh, in our country and in my observation, so participation is different of level. No, so participation in local level, national level, and international level. So there are some mechanisms to create some participation for the civil society and other stakeholders. So we have developed some examples in our country how community can take part in the decision making process. So in our support, with our support, community groups have developed a climate forum. So comprising different groups, so teacher, journalist, youth, and other social excluded communities. So they have some programs and they are actually uh, uh, monitor some climate funded projects and they prepare some hand notes, notebook findings, and they get back to the concerned authorities with their findings. And this is the process to get into the decision making process. So this is the process we are developing in our country. But in my view, so climate change discourse and human rights discourse is quite in public perception is quite different. So because after some climatic hazards, people are becoming more vulnerable and they are actually in getting in such a situation that authorities are not considering them as human beings. So authority are treating them and delivering some relief work, so not considering the human rights approach. So and based on the human rights approach, they are delivering some reliefs, quote unquote. So this is the gaps in between human rights based approach and climate discourses. So and yesterday I asked an questions that um, due to the climate change impact, if some citizens of some certain countries are being violated from human rights. For example, in my country, peasant society are losing their cultivating lands due to the saline intrusion. So this is not actually um, obligation. This is not the obligation of only our government. So this is how you will define that who will be obligated to fulfill that rights. So these are the some dynamics and some questions exist. So I'm not sure whether the panel will respond to this question.
Thank you very much. The lady just behind you was no. Okay, a bit further. All right, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Lisa Meinecke from Ecologic Institute in Berlin. I would like to pick up on the first statement of Ann-Kathrin, commenting on the sometimes frustrating participation process in German administrative structures. And I was wondering, yeah, so it sometimes feels like, yeah, you're invited to share your ideas and standpoints. They say, thank you very much. No, we're going to do what we're going to do anyways. Do you have a procedure to cope with that? Do you track down what is actually taken up? Cool. I'd be very interested to hear that. And do you have an idea how to, how this structure could be changed to make it a little less frustrating, a little more efficient, maybe? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very interesting stories and questions. Maybe I'll just invite Nana and Ann-Kathrin to respond directly to Lisa's question, basically about being frustrated with this process and not knowing what the meaningful impacts will be out of it.
Okay, against frustration, like organize demos and marches and take to the streets. put pressure on decision makers. That's really like what we as Friends of the Earth Germany do. We are taking part in all these consultations, but at the same time, we try to put pressure on decision makers by organizing demos, organizing marches, putting pressures from the outside. Like we think just being inside and talking will never be enough. It's always needed, and it's good against the frustration because it's something that's inspiring. It's something that makes you feel strong. And like how we deal with the Coal Commission in Germany, for example, is we're on the one hand, we are inside, it takes us a lot of time and resources to be inside and to really play the game and talk with them. But at the same time, we firmly believe that change can only come if you're a strong force in the streets and tell decision makers that a big part of society is really against coal and wants a fossil fuel phase out, for example.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I guess frustration is, I mean, we're all probably who are sitting up here are frustrated every once in a while. That's part of our business. But I just want to really say that talking about participation does not only mean that we want the same processes and the same institution and just put the catchy concept of participation in there. There are, of course, many levels of participation. You can just inform societies or communities or groups of people, or you can really have an impact on the outcome. And I think it is important to really say that public participation is an opportunity for real societal change, and we are not only calling for that catchy phrase, but we're really calling for different processes, for different institutions who have been set up with that old term of really government, like top-down structure. And also I think it is important, which is also a bit linking to the child question, it is important to really highlight, and I think that's what we're doing, to highlight the interlinkages of rights and human rights, social environmental rights to the climate change responses. So everyone knows that climate change is harming rights, but the idea that the responses of climate change are actually also violating a lot of rights and are affecting people and are affecting social environmental principles has to be underlined again and again, to make this a space that these principles are actually to make this a space that really people are in the center and not and nothing else but people. Yeah.
Adrian, you also wanted to respond.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I learned at first when I came to COP and I couldn't enter rooms was that it's a party-driven process, and it has been for 24 years like that. And if we meet in Costa Rica on the 25, it will be a quarter of a century that it is like that. And when we think about this, it's maybe the states do not fit the scale of the problem. So when you think about children, for example, I mean, we're deciding what actions we should do in the next years, but what we're actually doing is deciding the future that they will have. So maybe having this level of urgency and also having them here and having their ideas and their thoughts about it is something that we need, because clearly leaving people out does not work, because what we're doing in COP24 is something that has not worked. And when I think about the limits of participation, clearly there is a need to be able to have inputs, to get to have information on what is being decided and influence in some manner, to effectively influence the decision making. But at the end, what we also have to think is the role of the state. I mean, how separate is the state from the people, from the right holders? And if we do not address this, then participation becomes only a technology of sitting down, having coffee, show me the NDC that you already drafted, and I'll say, oh, well, what can I say? I don't really understand, and you never talked about it, which is usually what happens in our countries. And then they'll review it each 5 years, and it'll continue like that. And that is not participating. We need a standardized process where we know our rights and we know our place, and people can be involved if we want to actually make some change.
Thank you, Ryan. Svetlana.
Yes, my background is lawyers. That's why I just came to environmental lawyer. And I would like to thank you very much for the questions, but specifically my attention goes to your about limits of public participation, outcomes, and actual decision which are to be made in this process. So why this political participation and city participation actually means a lot, not only for giving an opportunity for citizens to express their civil rights. So that's crucial, of course, but that's not only the way. The second way why it's important is, and the second reason why it's important, it's influence for political decision making, of course. And that's why, because it's about political decision making, it's limited by laws and regulations. Every country has specific law on public participation, and it depends what rules actually limit or unlimit the public participation among that. But it can be tricky because these public participation may be different. For example, you have public gatherings, public hearings, you have even what we call the peaceful protest. It's also written in laws how long it should be, that you have to register event beforehand, and your peaceful protest as well. That means a lot. If we would like more limits, we have to influence politically. If we would like to more wider, broader limits of participation. When I was campaigning against the shale gas development in my region, when big corporates came, and I didn't know about divestment yet that much as far as I know now, but there were public hearings organized, and but only because of a law allowed to have these public hearings in different forms. They were like five hours of presenting the technology and 10 minutes for speaking. That's what we consider to be inappropriate limits. So that's why it's all interconnected that much. Outcomes and actual decisions, of course, they also should be under the laws, because only in this way they are mandatory for implementation. So probably the main outcome is if we make a campaign or move towards political decisions, is to develop such democratic procedures and provisions which enable us in the future to make a broad and wide public participation. And that's what we are now doing in the cities, where we support climate movement development. We try to empower people to set up the rules first, because there are different ways. You can set up the rules from the bottom, and you can also just accept the national strategy, but always these national goals are less ambitious. Instead of when they are, it's developed on the ground from regional level. Thank you.
Thanks. I have Diego and then Luz.
I think the questions were very diverse, but I think one point that we haven't touched on, and I think can help address, especially the question from Abu Bashir, is participation. One dimension of participation that these guidelines don't talk about and they exclude from them is participation in government. So, and I think I didn't touch this issue a bit. So, if governments are more inclusive, and I here allow myself to, on my personal capacity, I'm Brazilian. And I look at, and it's just an example, but since always, it's not now, it's not this government, it's not previous government, but 54% of the population of Brazil is from Afro descendants. How many Brazilians have you met here? Exceptionally, I'm surprised to see that in this forum we see Afro-descendant Brazilians and indigenous Brazilians, because in others, including human rights, you don't see them. They're not there. The Brazilians that you see are those who look like me, who speak the English I speak, which is a huge privilege. So if governments and international organizations are not inclusive, and the NGOs fighting here as well are not inclusive and reflect the societies that they're supposed to be reflecting, and that brings us to the discussion of electoral reforms even, we won't have meaningful participation of those mostly affected. And I think this is a quite crucial point. And that would allow us in the national level, and to mention what Abu Bashir was saying, in the bringing, perhaps if we bring more the voices, and we have a constituency here of subnational government cities and so on, they tend to be a bit closer to the people, and maybe with that we can approach a little bit better of the diversity of our peoples here represented. And the final point to address Fernando from Ecuador is, at least at the international level, on the decision-making, voting capacity, the first organization that comes to my mind is the ILO, the International Labour Organization, that has is a tripartite organization. And there, trade unions, employers, and states have a vote. They are part of. They are also. They are employers of the bureaucracy that works for that organization. And it's very interesting to see how the bureaucrats of the world, the ILO, think differently from us, who just have the states as bosses. And that's quite unique. So being creative, and I think the platform for indigenous people and local communities is an innovative. Perhaps it's not going to be a platform that will have a lot of substantial decision-making on the ambition of states and so on, but it's a very important step and a creative, and I think that's what we need, a bit of creativity in how we shape our institutions. Yeah.
Thank you, Diego. Now we have Luis, and then I think we'll open for another brief round of comments and questions.
I wanted to address the question about children because I came from the Youth and Children constituency, and I think that definitely children need to, have to be here. And of course, we all see that are underrepresented, and maybe a way to include them in the UNFCCC sessions, negotiations, it's like creating and designing specific spaces, more, how can I say this, easier, more, not that abstract, not too complex, and approach them from another side, maybe related to arts, maybe related to games, or, trying to design spaces for children and from a different approach, not too technical. That's what I meant to say. And I think that I will bring this to the constituency because it's something that we really we don't talk about this. So yes, I think that is a really good question, and I take the challenge for next year to design these spaces to include children.
Thank you, Luz, for this solutions-oriented comment. Would anybody like to share another story related to public participation that reflects on the process that you're involved in at national level or here at the COPs in terms of helping those most affected participate in climate decision making? I see the lady in blue.
Thank you very much. I'm enjoying your comments all. They're so insightful, and you had asked for some solutions. And I think we have talked about children, and we have had mention of the youth. I have a 15-year-old. If you can put something in a video game, you completely have his attention. We have, 16, 17-year-olds who in the United States in 2 years, when it is our next election, will be able to vote. I live in Idaho. The science teacher puts 1 day on climate change in the curriculum. And last year and this year in the high school, I have volunteered to the principal of the school and to the teacher to go and give a short account of climate change, particularly with reference to gender, because I am with Gender CC and the Women in Gender constituency. And they have always said, yes, thank you, wonderful, and never followed up on it at all. If something like video games or other computer interactive processes can be engaged by our NGOs and our organizations, as well as by the UNFCCC and governments who actually understand that climate change is real, which Trump admitted last week, but also that it's anthropogenic. If we can engage that 2 years worth of youth now, they will be voting in that election in 2 years, and they can really influence and change things. And right now, the strongest influencing voice in government on gun control and on climate is actually coming from the youth. So it is their future, and that would be one of the ways to engage a solution that can be in relatively short term and bring an education, because I think we have a moral obligation, each of us and our organizations, to educate the youth whose governments refuse to educate them. I know people whose jobs, they have been told that they will lose their job if they continue to teach climate change as an anthropogenic event. So we really need your help from people outside, because when you're in places where it's more able, you are able to have that conversation, you're okay. But my son is also half African. I cannot send my son out to walk in the street because his probability of being shot because he's black is much higher than it is for the white participants. So we need to help each other in the communities that need, and some of those communities are actually in the global north, like my community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any hands. Right. I would be wondering also, what other possibilities do you see for reform in this specific process? I mean, I always hear in the hallways it's a party-driven process. Decision-making is with the parties mostly, and sorry.
Sorry, she wants to participate, but I'm going to try to translate for her, or maybe Adri, you could help?
Please.
Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es Elba Rivera.
Thank you. My
soy de
name
Nicaragua.
is Elba Rivera.
Elba Rivera.
And she's from Nicaragua.
Sí, donde nosotros tenemos mucha experiencia con participación desde el movimiento campesino.
We have a lot of experience with participation from the farmers sector.
Quiero decir que en Nicaragua
Peasants, I'm sorry. Sorry, peasants.
En Nicaragua está en pleno el extractivismo. Se vende las tierras para la palma africana, se venden nuestras minas, se vendió una ruta para el canal interoceánico.
So extractivism in Nicaragua, it's in growing, and they have been selling land for palm production and for the mining industry.
From they have been selling land for the mining sector, also for the construction of the interoceánico canal.
El gobierno le dio una concesión a un empresario chino, porque la China anda de compra en Latinoamérica, yo creo que en el mundo también.
The government sent the land to a Chinese businessman because apparently China is going shopping for land in Latin America.
Y los campesinos, el movimiento campesino se ha organizado y desde hace 5 años está protestando junto con los indígenas y el gobierno creol para proteger sus tierras que están dentro de la ruta del canal.
And the peasants movement has been working with the indigenous communities and the Creole communities from 5 years now to fight the acquisition of land for the construction of the canal.
Sí, y esas protestas campesinas han sido apoyadas por la Academia de la Ciencia, por el pueblo nicaragüense, pero ha encontrado las balas del gobierno.
And all this movement has been supported by the science, the academics, but sorry, it has been encounter opposition from the government.
Sí, en abril los colonos están invadiendo, pero en abril hubo la quema de 6,000 hectáreas en la reserva Indio Maíz, en la zona donde yo vivo.
In April, the colonizers burned 6,000 hectares of the reservation Indio Maíz, from where she comes.
Y los estudiantes universitarios más el movimiento campesino protestaron y así inició también la crisis política que vivimos actualmente en Nicaragua.
The communities with the student sector protested, and that's how the crisis that now Nicaragua is living started.
Thank you. I don't want to cut you short. I think it's really important to have these stories. I'm just really curious, are you bringing this also, is this something that negotiators are responsive to, or when you speak with the government, is it difficult to engage? I'm very curious about that aspect. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sí, es ya conocido a nivel nacional e internacional la situación. Y lo que yo aquí quiero decir es que nosotros tenemos dos grandes reservas. Tenemos el lago de Nicaragua, que es la reserva para Centroamérica de agua y que están sufriendo mucho de la invasión y que el gobierno cierra los ojos y está mudo y sordo también.
Okay, thank you very much.
No,
You're going to translate more, or?
what she says is that the communities are at risk because also there is the lake, the Nicaraguan lake, which is one of the biggest water reservoirs in Central America, is also being threatened by this conflict, and at the end the government has his eyes closed and also his ears closed, and is not helping.
Thank you very much for sharing this story. We have 5 minutes left. If I see any questions from the floor, if not, I would invite each of the panelists, I don't know, we have 7, so I'll be really brief, but just to give your demands for what you really want to see changing in this process specifically in terms of participation, or if you prefer, what you want to change nationally, just very brief as a sort of closing statement. Thank you.
Got a bit by surprise, but I think I would emphasize the point that we said when we speak about human rights and participation, diversity, ensuring that all perspectives are on the table is very important, and that includes gender equality, that includes racial representation of minorities representation, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, children, youth, and all the constituencies that participate in this process somehow, but also reflected in the formal structures of the UNFCCC, of the other international organizations involved, of the states themselves.
I think for us, the inclusion of human rights within the rulebook is one of the things that we're more focused now, because participating without having this contextual reference to human rights in many of our countries in Latin America does not equal to just and climate action. So, for example, in the case of Nicaragua, as my colleague there is sharing, it's very important for climate action for this to be present. I understand for development countries, maybe this is not relevant, but for many others, it is essential for human rights to be in the rule book.
Thank you. Nana?
Well, we as a women and gender constituencies have a lot of demands to the process, UNFCCC process. You can have a look at womangenderclimate.org, because I want to actually focus also on the demands we have within the upcoming days. I think it is really fundamentally important that we have a linkage or reference to public participation, to human rights, to gender equality, to the acknowledgement of traditional knowledge and local communities within the NDCs. The NDCs are the core principle of our national climate politics. They are very important, going to stick with us within the next decade. So yeah, I just want to highlight that, and the importance that public participation and non-party stakeholders also have to be involved in the global stock take and other aspects, but I think I have to stop here.
Excellent. Maybe Raquel or
It's being said that we should increase ambition in our NDCs for 2020. I believe citizens and citizen climate action has the capacity of increased ambition in NDCs. So if governments, if parties really want to increase ambition, they should take into account what citizens and the public can do for that.
Thanks. Maybe we have 2 last statements. Only if you want, of course.
Yes. I want to stress what I said before. I think for youth is very important capacity building, and in order to meaningfully engage with the NDC implementation, we need that. We have the space, but we need the capacity building apart from the resources, and I think that that is the main message that I want to give to you.
Thank you. And Nana, Svetlana, you have the last words. Please be brief if you can. We're almost over time.
I only can say one sentence, probably, that I'm so much willing to see the effectiveness of our civil rights participative approach here until COP24 is not yet finished in some probably indeed voiced and make us all witness that how legal limits and legal background for public participation makes a real difference when at the same time people are still making difference, and people are probably it will be more practically it will be implemented in that those provisions in a global stocktake won't be removed from that document, and we will have more increased NDCs, which enable further political decisions in the way to stop climate change.
All right, I believe Anne-Catherine would like to. So I would like to invite you all to give a great round of applause for the panelists, and thank you very much. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and it was a really lively conversation, not just a boring panel. So thank you very much.